The Pack Horse Librarians of Eastern Kentucky. During the Depression, they delivered books and other reading materials in remote, rural areas to people with no other access to the world of reading. By 1933, unemployment in Appalachia had risen to 40%. Hundreds of coal mines had been closed in response to the shutdown of factories nationwide. Thousands of miners were out of work. A few years into the Great Depression, reporter Lorena Hickok traveled to Appalachia and witnessed infant starvation, rampant pellagra, and severe lack of sanitation. Poor rocky soil made growing food difficult. It was desperate times in the mountains. In response, FDR's Works Progress Administration WPA program set out to put people to work. Putting people back to work most often meant putting men back to work, and most WPA jobs involved heavy manual labor. Roads and schools and parks were built, tunnels were dug, buildings were constructed. As the Depression intensified, men abandoned their families, leaving many women as heads of household. In response, WPA jobs were created that were more seemly for women: sewing, the creation of Braille books, works in schools and cafeterias, and the Pack Horse Librarians Project. Book delivery? Could that be accomplished by women? Never mind that it often meant traveling by horse or mule, or by foot, up a nearly invisible trail covering 18 to 20 miles a day. Never mind that one pack horse librarian, Mrs. Mary Luttrell, recalls rainy day roads that were knee-deep in mud. She said that she would have to hold her feet out to the sides of the horse, and the mud was so deep on the roads, and the horse would have to swim the creek when it rained. Her horse took her every place, though, that she wanted to go. It's no surprise that country in Kentucky was home to one of the earliest pack horse librarian programs. The state was notoriously underbooked at the start of the Depression, with 63% of its residents having no access to public libraries. The first pack horse library program was established in 1934 in Leslie County. Within 2 years, nearby Harlan, Clay, Whitley, Jackson, and Lee counties had their own programs. In their young reader's book, Down Cut Shin Creek, Kathy Appelt and Jean Ann Cannella do an admirable job of conveying the structure of the Pack Horse Project. The way it worked was simple. The WPA paid the salaries for the librarians to maintain a headquarters library, usually at the county seat, and to carry books on horseback throughout the country. The circuits were worked out so that new books were dropped off at Center 1. The books already there were taken on to Center 2, and so on. A center might be a school or a community center, a post office, or even a home. Salaries for the librarians and supervisors were the only thing supported by the federal government. The bookwomen, as they were called, were paid $28 a month, from which pack horse feed and lodging had to be paid. Finding the books fell to the locals, and it wasn't easy. At the request of the Kentucky State PTA president, Mrs. B. W. Whitaker, PTAs across Kentucky donated used books and magazines. It wasn't long before word got to Lena Nocifer, the chair of library services for the Kentucky Congress of Parents and Teachers, who set up the penny fund plan. The result? $101.70 raised, which was 131 new books purchased. Over time, donations come from all over the country. The most desired were children's books. Robinson Crusoe, Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm, and Gulliver's Travels were favorites. Picture books were a plus. The pictures helped non-readers figure out the story. Poetry was often requested, with Robert Louis Stevenson's A Child Garden of Verses at the top of the list. Men sought magazines like Popular Mechanics. Women requested Women's Home Companion and Ladies' Home Journal. Not allowed in the book women's sacks were thriller magazines like Love Story and True Story, or detective magazines. And always, Bibles were available and sometimes were read from as declarations of faith and trustworthiness. Pack horse librarians stopped at schools where they were greeted by grateful teachers and students. And sometimes they stopped at a cabin so remote that a resident hadn't seen a soul since the last book delivery. Book women often did double duty, carrying messages, letters, and news of the world through the mountains. Packing reading materials in saddlebags and feed sacks and slinging them across the back of horses and mules left the materials in constant need of repair. Heavy usage by patrons was also damaging, a problem that some pack horse librarians solved by making highly treasured bookmarks from old Christmas cards to keep readers from folding the page covers and corners. Many librarians took magazines and newspapers so worn they couldn't be restored and made scrapbooks from the pages. Jason Vance of Middle Tennessee State University's James E. Walker Library traveled to the FDR Presidential Library in Hyde Park, New York, to read and photograph the collected scrapbooks. That fall, Vance writes in his 2012 article in Library and Information History into 11 theme categories: recipes, mountain ballads, pictures, postcards, biographical sketches of famous people, local history, Kentucky history, quilt patterns, old place names, local flora, and collections of articles on a given subject. There was a great demand for religious materials, and many of the scrapbooks featured scripture and Sunday school lessons. The scrapbooks were compiled by pack horse librarians during weekly report gatherings at the county library headquarters, and included many contributions from library patrons along their routes. In 1940, Vance writes, 2,653 scrapbooks were circulated among the pack horse library patrons. They became important cultural artifacts that offer a window into the lives and interests of readers in the Depression era Appalachian region of eastern Kentucky, Vance asserts. Eleanor Roosevelt was a strong advocate of the Pack Horse Library Project. If the women are willing to do things because it's going to help their neighbors, I think we'll win out. In this way, worn-out reading material found new life and allowed the Pack Horse librarians to conduct what Vance calls a unique, federally funded guerrilla publishing program. It's worth noting that liber, the Latin root of the word library, means both book and free, he writes. Libraries stand for and exemplify something that needs defending. The public institutions that, Even in the age of atomization, polarization, and inequity serve as the bedrock of civil society. We have Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt to thank for providing both pack horse librarians in Depression-era Eastern Kentucky freedom from poverty and the freedom of books shared. It's a story worth remembering.